Welcome back to Analysis, where we've been discussing the aftermath of Afghanistan's presidential elections, which took place on Saturday. With the voting over, the question now obviously is who the next president will be and whether he can adequately respond to the demands of the Afghan people in their call for democratic governance. There are growing concerns over the handling of the security transition in the country, as the United States prepares to withdraw its troops by the end of this year. Some fear that Afghanistan is not yet prepared to effectively manage its own internal affairs and may well enter another era of inevitable violence. While Obama hails the elections as a milestone towards democracy, it may be too little too soon to predict what a post-Karzai government will look like. And will reconciliation be possible? And will this be the end to a tortured history for the country of violence, foreign occupation, internal strife and great suffering? Joining me in the studio are Dr. Mohammed Hosak, William Reeve and Paul Schulte. Well, obviously, we don't know who the next president's going to be, Paul Schulte, but the one thing we do know is it's not going to be Hamid Karzai. So I think it's a good moment to sort of sum up his legacy after 12 or 13 years, actually, of rule. What would you say are the main things that he's managed to achieve in that time?
What he's managed to achieve is he's presided over Afghanistan re-establishing, reinventing itself with considerable Western help as a modern state with democratic aspirations. And he's managed to give some credibility to the Afghan government, and a large security force structure has been created, and people have been willing to fight and die for that, and that's enormously important. His legacy in other areas is, of course, more mixed, that the huge billions of dollars have been put in to a system which many people feel is corrupt, where drugs have not been dealt with and are a major part of the economy, where there's just little public belief in good governance and neutrality, and partly because of the extremely corrupt 2009 election process that he did exert himself into because he wanted to get re-elected, because he could be re-elected under the Constitution. So what he's handing on is quite obviously a mixed bag in ways I don't think were necessary. He made choices which I think were more divisive and more compromising than he needed.
You mean over the 2009 election?
Over that and a number of other things. He's created a legacy of bad feeling with the Pakistanis, and he's completely lost the trust of the American government, and I suspect of the British government, but we're too polite to say so. And there is the whole question of the security agreement, the bilateral security arrangement with the Americans. He's refused to sign it. All of the candidates for the presidency say they will, so that's good. But will the Americans stay in sufficient numbers to support the Afghan security forces in the fighting there will inevitably be? Whatever happens, it won't. The Taliban will not reconcile until they're clear they're not going to win. And if the Americans draw down in big numbers, that's going to be very bad for Afghanistan. And then there's the bigger question of international confidence. Afghanistan as a state can only maintain its present encouraging rate of progress with substantial international assistance, especially to pay for the security forces. Will that be forthcoming to a system which is seen to be very corrupt? That's very uncertain, and a lot will depend on whether the next president runs a cleaner act and a more credible state structure than Karzai did.
Well, I think we'll discuss those questions in a minute. But first of all, Mohammed, just on the first point, what is his legacy in your view?
Yeah, just like Paul said, I don't think his legacy is very perfect. But as a British Afghan, I know since 2001 there is a lot of achievements that he has got. Today we have got a functioning state, and as Paul said, we have got a functioning military and police, which successfully defended the elections. And for me, the most important thing was that he stood on his words, that he promised that he will make sure that he would be impartial in these elections, even though there were a lot of rumors that he stood by Zalmay Rasool, but he never openly supported him, and he has until now stood by his words of making sure that the transfer of power from himself to the next president is democratically done. And I think that's one of the greatest things he has done, and that's something that I admire the most about him.
Well, it's certainly true. I remember about a year ago people were saying he might call off the election or somehow change the constitution to give himself a third term and all that. So
exactly. I mean, we all know there were so many rumors. Nobody actually believed anything that President Karzai said. But even until the eve of the elections, when the election finished, he came and he gave a speech to the nation. He said that he stands firm on his words and he will make sure that he does whatever he can to transfer the power from himself onto the next president of Afghanistan. And I think this is the most important historic moment in Afghanistan's history. And if he succeeds in doing that, and hopefully there is no instability and we have a clear-cut winner in these elections, I think that would be one of the greatest achievements that he has, and I would really admire him for that, honestly.
And William Reeve, what do you think his legacy is, your view?
Well, there are two sides, really. I think one of the negative sides is how he's not dealt with corruption, for instance. Corruption has been started to be dealt with at lower levels, but there are people right at the top among the powers that be who are corrupt, and he hasn't dealt with those in a way I think he could have done. But on the other hand, some of those people he's managed to keep within the fold of the government, like a lot of the former warlords, for instance. He's kept them on side, which has been quite an achievement that I don't think many people have given him credit for, because if he hadn't kept them on side, there would have been far more chaos in Afghanistan, I think. I mean, there are quite a large number within his fold. There are two particular ones that he hasn't. I mean, Hekmatyar is one of them that he hasn't had on side. And probably never would, and the other's Haqqani, who he obviously wouldn't. But otherwise, he's had all the other former warlords on the side, which I think's been quite clever. That, you know, as Westerners, we probably don't notice all the time he's has probably spent doing this. I've often thought that he was potentially, as a character, more of a sort of an overall president, a Baba of the nation, sort of father of the nation figure, and that somebody like Ashraf Ghani would have been a very good prime minister if the constitution had worked together. If there'd been a sort of body like that, I think it would have probably worked much better.
Why do you think Karzai became so hostile to the Americans? I mean, what was the reason for it?
I think it might have been political, quite frankly, and I've never quite worked out that you get the outward noises of how hostile he's been, and he's probably having a cosy chat with the American ambassador in the meantime. I mean, you know, it's difficult to know what's happening with discussions that we don't see, and I think at the moment it has become very hostile. For a long time it was the Brits that he used to be the most hostile to. I used to speak to various people in the cabinet who, every time Britain was mentioned, he'd start sort of seething in the mouth. But now it sort of went towards the Americans, and I think it's partly, I mean, the Afghans would be much better at commenting on this, but it's partly playing to the Afghan audience, this, to show that he's actually...
Populist card.
Yeah, it is the populist card, I think, that he's playing very strongly, because he knows he can speak to the Americans. They desperately want him to do this, that and the other. So he can play out to the populist card, which I think is the main point of how he has been playing it myself. But
now, on the security issue which you raised, Paul, and reconciliation with the Taliban or not. I mean, let's assume for the moment Abdullah wins the election. I mean, he was part of the Northern Alliance, which fought a civil war with the Taliban for years and years in the 1990s. It's going to be very hard, if he is president, for him to think about any real reconciliation and peace talks with the Taliban, isn't it?
Yes, but I imagine he wouldn't lead that effort himself. He would try and find a Pathan to lead any political reconciliation. But that isn't going to happen until the question of power and control in the country is fought out. And unfortunately, there will be a continuingly bloody period, perhaps a more bloody period, to try and determine whether the Taliban can get what they think they can, which is control of large areas of the country and eventually Kabul by violence, to see that when Western forces pull out, whether the Afghan security forces, with whatever residual air support and other logistics they get from the Americans, will be strong enough to continue to resist the Taliban takeover.
So in other words, for at least 2 years, let's say, there's going to be continued war.
Yes.
While the Taliban try and work out,
yeah.
Can we win or do we have to sue for peace?
And a lot will depend upon Western willingness as after the Soviets, a lot depended upon the willingness to continue to support the government in power against insurgents. If that money and military assistance and aid dries up, then the outlook will be bleak.
Mohammed, I mean, you represent the Chamber of Commerce and Industry, the British Afghan Chamber of Commerce and Industry. I mean, so the economy is obviously very important. Are you worried that the Americans pull out? I mean, even if they don't pull out down to zero, that it will inevitably mean a loss of jobs for people and loss of aid as well?
Yeah, I think security is extremely crucial in Afghanistan for its economic self-dependency. All the investors that we talk to here in the city, one of the very first questions that they have on their mind is security, because we know that the world is coming out of recession. There is a lot of money out there, is ready to be invested in new frontiers. And when it comes to Afghanistan, security is one of the most important issues for investors and businessmen, because they want to be reassured that before they invest their money in Afghanistan, that there would be forces and security enough to defend their investments. And I think that the elections was a very important moment in the whole story, because I think the security forces did show that they can defend Afghanistan's interests. And I mean, on one of the most critical days of Afghanistan, where the Taliban had promised to derail the elections no matter what, and they failed. So this, I think, would give some encouragement to the international investors that Afghanistan's security forces are actually capable of now defending the interests of Afghanistan, and they would be able to do the same when it comes to major investments from the rest of the world into Afghanistan's mineral resources. And I always work to encourage the British investors to come into Afghanistan, and I hope that all the sacrifices, as a British Afghan, for me, is very important, because for me, both the sacrifices that Afghanistan has given in this whole war against terror, and then the sacrifices as a British citizen, and some of my friends whose families were soldiers, British soldiers, and they went into Afghanistan, and they have their time, the money, and lives have been sacrificed. I want the British private sector to now take an active role in Afghanistan, and there is a lot of opportunities for them, and they're pretty lucrative. And I hope if we can succeed in giving them this confidence that the security forces are able to defend their interests, then we will be able to succeed in getting the investors into Afghanistan. And I think that would be extremely crucial for the future of Afghanistan, which is not aid, but self-dependency.
But self-dependency means your own Afghan businessmen also doing a lot. You can't just rely on foreign investment, can you?
Exactly.
I mean, is there any real sign that Afghans themselves are investing in the country and developing industry?
Yeah. Afghanistan is what we call a virgin economy. Afghanistan has so much opportunities, it's unbelievable, Jonathan, that the market was so lucrative that if you know about the Aga Khan Foundation, it's a charitable organization. They were one of the first ones to go into Afghanistan. They invested in a telecom industry. They invested in the telecom industry. In Roshan, an Afghan company, mobile phone company, was set up. Now Roshan is becoming a multinational. It's gone out from Afghanistan. It's almost become $1 billion company, and it's gone into Africa. It's expanded. I know some mining companies that started from Afghanistan. One of the Nadri Investments company started the Afghanistan Gold Company. Now it has become a regional Central Asian mining company. So there are real entrepreneurs in Afghanistan. And I spoke to Mr. Ghaznafar, one of the banking and the mining industry Afghan entrepreneur, who's also not only, he's an Afghan, his business started from Afghanistan, but he's spread all over Central Asia now. And this is the great thing about Afghanistan. Afghanistan is the gateway into these lucrative economies of Central Asia. The 68% of the Afghans who are under 25, they're ready, they're trained, they've worked with international organizations. So it's a great opportunity for international organizations to go and have this human resource which is already trained on international standards, to use them not to only do business in Afghanistan, but in the surrounding region, and more specifically, as British investors are very interested in Central Asia. So I think there is a lot of Afghan entrepreneurs, and they're not only changing the private sector in Afghanistan, but in the region. Because Afghanistan is just like London. It's the melting pot of cultures. We have got the Uzbeks, the Turkmens. You would not find a single Afghan who speaks a single language. Almost all Afghans are multilinguals. And because of that, that's why Afghanistan had this history of leadership in the region, both as a civilization of learning and also Afghanistan history as a leader in the region. We know the borders of Afghanistan, or the ancient Khorasan convoy from the Bay of Bengal all the way to the Caucasus. So these people, I mean, international community hasn't done justice to Afghans, honestly.
Well, this is a very, very optimistic view of the future as well as the present. I mean, you're laughing, William. I mean,
No, I was saying thank you very much for the history lesson. You know,
the history lesson and the sort of prospectus for the future.
Invasions
I mean,
outwards.
are you sort of confident that Afghanistan really can stand on its own feet when all its aid money and budget money comes out?
Well, I hope it will, because it'll have to. I mean, it's so often things happen because they have to happen and they need to happen. While there have been so many Westerners with uniforms and arms in the country, it's been difficult for, say, Hamid Karzai to really be seen as the president of the country when the world's greatest superpower has had the actual guns and the power in the nation. And I think once that is drawn down, the next president is going to find it easier to portray himself as the boss of the country and actually really get going with things. And I do take up your point about various Afghan business houses. I spoke to a lot of them just before Christmas, the Ghazanfars and Sadat and people like that, Nadiri. And some of those made a lot of money by selling petrol and diesel to the American armed forces. And they have since then built up and started going into oil and gas fields, potentially, and doing all sorts of other, endless different things they branched into. But, they've set up banks. One of them has got an airline now, one of the Hazara ones, and done all sorts of things. I found it incredibly encouraging to see all this happening, and it had been a big change in a very short time. And if that,
sorry, I agree with you. And William, it probably all did start with the government contracting and the international community being there. But what is very admirable is that the fact that these entrepreneurs didn't stop there. They maybe were selling diesel or supplying food or something like that. But now what they're doing is, in that region, what they're doing is, I don't think most of the surrounding countries have done that. When it comes to mining, I think logistics, Afghan logistics companies transport all the way from Belarus to Pakistan. So I mean, I think
they won't be able to sell the diesel and petrol to the Americans, so they've got to get on with the other things as well. It sort of needs must yet again.
Exactly, but I think the
Paul, I mean, you mentioned opium. I mean, Afghan entrepreneurship has also been shown in the development of the heroin business, a great initiative and innovation, etc. I mean, how can that be dealt with and stopped?
Only by a process of state reform, I think, with some very painful choices about who's going to be warned off or arrested and put away, and a lot of political and real blood spilt on the floor about really getting people out who are not prepared to end their corruption and their client protection networks of trafficking and undermining the law.
Concerted effort from the central government, I think, which
that's a precondition, but there'll have to be other things.
Has not been there, either for the corruption or the counter-narcotics. It just, if there's been any semblance of it, it certainly hasn't been visible at all. And that's why I think somebody like, say, Ashraf Ghani, I'm not here to promote any particular candidates, but say he was president or Abdullah, if they really have a concerted effort right from the start that they're going to really deal with this, I think that's one of the few ways where things could actually get going.
And Ghani, as an internationally recognised technocrat, is aware of the considerable experimentation and literature on anti-corruption measures, the Transparency International agenda, for example. So he would have a sense of the state-of-the-art possibilities that could be brought to bear on it if there were the political will from the president, whoever he was.
Yeah. And I actually worked with him when there was the currency exchange program in Afghanistan in 2002, soon after 9/11, and he was extremely good then at really sort of kicking the backsides of all sorts of people who might have made the whole program very difficult. And it actually worked. Nobody was killed bringing in all these counterfeit currencies and putting out all the new ones. I mean, it was a concerted effort with lots of people, but it was the government at the time had a real focus on making it thoroughly work. And it did work. And other programs, they haven't had that, like on the corruption or the counter-narcotics.
If we're talking about the wider economic prospects, I think it is worth mentioning on the positive sides is the Chinese interest in the minerals, which is apparently very serious and long-term, and they're going to invest a lot. On the negative side, I think it's the population growth. In some ways, that's good. You have a young, vigorous population, educable, interested in change. On the other hand, that's an awful lot of jobs you have to create. Otherwise, there's just going to be immiseration in the country.
We're coming sort of to the end. We've only got about 2 minutes. I just want to deal with one final point. I mean, you said that for Karzai to sort of criticize the Americans, condemn the Americans even, is a populist thing. I mean, that implies that a lot of Afghans actually do resent the whole American effort. So my question really is to all of you. In turn, let's start with you. I mean, in 5 years' time, let's say, what will the American legacy be in Afghanistan? What will Afghans think of what the Americans have done?
Well, I think, as in the case with the Russians and everybody else who's been in Afghanistan at any stage, I think people, taking a historical view, will be slightly kinder than they are at the moment. And I think that will be the case. Like at the moment, there are many people, that's certainly been the case, looking back at the Russian times, when Afghans loathed having the Russians in their country, where people say, well, the Russians were much better and they did it like this, that and the other. In 5 years' time, when somebody else has come in, whether it's the Chinese, hopefully not, they'll look back and say, oh, it was so much better during the American time.
And you?
I actually think that America has done a lot for Afghanistan, and there is a lot of good praise from the Afghan people for for America standing with the Afghans shoulder to shoulder and helping them have a functioning state. I know there has been some disagreements when it came to Karzai, and it was mainly to do with the civilian casualties of certain midnight operations that the Americans were carrying out. Otherwise, I think Afghans are very thankful for what America and Britain has done for them.
Paul's turn.
Well,
We've just got 1 minute.
guess people will remember the night raids and the airstrikes, but that will be forgiven if Afghanistan moves into the kind of future that we're talking about. If, however, this melts down in continued civil war and worse, Taliban success, then I think America's time and the fighting that it has led to will be remembered with regret and horror.
Well, I think on that note we have to end. So thank you very much, Paul Schulte, Mohammed Hotak and William Reeve. And of course, thank you all for watching.